Nancy's great-grandfather, Samuel Cunard, born in 1787, was a civil engineer and founded the Cunard Steamship Line in Halifax, Nova Scotia in 1840. This enterprise began as a transatlantic mail service and evolved into the luxury cruise line we know today. He moved to England in 1859, where Queen Victoria made him a baronet. It's with this fortune that Sir Bash Cunard, Nancy's father, at age 43, married Maud Alice Burke of San Francisco, age 22. Maud's father had died in her teens, and her mother acquired many rich admirers, including Horace Carpentier, a wealthy real estate magnate and the first mayor of Oakland. It was Carpentier who encouraged Maud's love of literature and theatre. When she visited London in 1894, she met famous Anglo-Irish author George Moore, at the time in his early 40s. Friends with Manet, Degas, Mallarmé, and Zola, Moore played a key role in Nancy's life as a type of surrogate father and is rumoured to have been her real father. The rumour is likely false. Nonetheless, he was important for Nancy's childhood, as she was lonely and isolated, and spent her time mostly in the care of servants, except when Lady Maud Cunard's famous friends came to call. Nancy Clara Cunard was born March 10, 1896, at Neville Holt. Today, the house is privately owned and hosts an opera. Before that, it was a boys' preparatory school, and before that, it was Nancy's home. Lady Cunard referred to motherhood as a low thing, the lowest. It's in this type of environment that Nancy grew to resent. 40 servants employed the house and grounds and would become Nancy's caretakers. Sir Bash spent his days sporting, Lady Cunard with friends in London and abroad, until, however, during visiting season. Nancy said of her childhood, "My picture of Holt is of constant arrivals and departures during half the year, of elaborate long teas on the lawn with tennis and croquet going on, of great winter logs blazing all day in the hall and morning room, with people playing bridge there for hours on end. Beautiful and exciting ladies move about in smart tailor-mades. Some are long in shot silk and striped taffeta. They stroll, laughing and chatting across the lawn." After Moore's affair with Lady Cunard in 1894, they became platonic friends. Despite Moore's sadness at this relegation, he grew fond of daughter Nancy. According to Nancy, "I suppose I was about 4 years old when I first remembered George Moore, and I suppose I may in some sort even call him my first friend, talking to me always in a manner beyond my years, and taking so much interest in all that concerns me. He is the central figure of childhood." Nancy made 2 or 3 trips to America at this time, on a luxury Cunard liner, of course, to meet Carpentier, living in Saratoga, New York. At home, Nancy would write in her diary about riding her pony, charades, picking mushrooms and blackberries, and hiding in the suits of armour. Her governess would read the entries aloud and write in it herself. When Nancy attended Miss Wolfe's private school in South Audley Street, London, her entries turned to Old English and French. Nancy was fierce and precocious. Her father, silent and alarming. Her mother, pretty and unsympathetic to children. Nancy missed her when she was away. George Moore was a hopeless romantic, a rebel, often standing up for Nancy against her mother and governess. Like when it was learnt she had snuck a copy of Eleanor Gwynne's romantic novel 3 Weeks from a guest who had left it behind at Neville Holt. Nancy read the whole thing. She confided in Moore, telling him she wanted to run away and be a vagabond. She showed him her secret treasure trove in a secluded ditch, where she dragged him out on walks. The treasures included some oddly curved root, a stick stripped of its bark, fierce sea green flints, and a small blue empty medicine bottle. By 1911, when Nancy was 13, her mother, Lady Cunard, now 38, fell in love with a music conductor, Thomas Beecham, 32. Rumours persisted in the nearby village of Medbourne that workers maintaining the clock tower could see the pair in the act through the window of Lady Cunard's bedroom. Bored of Sir Bash and all his time spent hunting, Lady Maud Cunard renamed herself Lady Emerald Cunard and moved Thomas Beecham and Nancy with her to London. It would be a relationship that would last 30 years. Nancy's days at Neville Holt were over. George Moore, giving up on the Celtic revival in pursuit of Lady Cunard, would move to London as well. The Cunards moved into 20 Cavendish Square, where Nancy completed her time at Miss Wolfe's school. The teacher had called her the cleverest pupil she had. By 1912, Nancy was off to Munich for German and music studies. It is here, living with a German family and governess, that she first tasted adult life, fully intent on being a poet. In 1913, she attended a girls' finishing school in Paris that she found more restrictive. In the summer of that year, her mother gathered her music and poetry lover friends together at a palazzo in Venice. This group was known as the Souls. Nancy befriended their children. Among them was her new best friend, Iris Tree. This young version dubbed themselves the Corrupt Coterie. They wrote witty poems, swam by moonlight, and threw all-night masquerades. They drank, huffed chloroform, and frequented clubs like the Cave of the Golden Calf and the Café Royal. The pre-war leader of the clique was Raymond Asquith, son of the Prime Minister. In 1914, one member, Sir Dennis Anson, aged 26, in high spirits, although not intoxicated, died from an undercurrent after jumping in the Thames at a midnight picnic. A musician, William Mitchell, died trying to save him. Another friend close to the group, amateur pilot and racing driver Gustave Hamil, died in a plane crash from England to France at the age of 24. The press blamed the incident on the coterie's mad youth, singling out Lady Diana Manners as the prime suspect. The media claimed the young men died trying to impress her. Then the war started, claiming 10 more members. A grief-stricken Lady Diana Manners, whom would later marry fellow member Duff Cooper, became the post-war coterie leader. When Nancy joined, she began derisively calling her mother her ladyship and had her coming-out party as a debutante just before the war. Her new best friend, Iris Tree, aged 17, had a romantic bohemian temperament. She recalled the status of art on the eve of World War I. Transition and danger were in the air. We responded like chameleons to every changing colour, turning from Meredith to Proust to Dostoevsky. Slightly tinged by the Yellow Book, an occasional absinthe left by Baudelaire and Wilde, flushed by liberalism, sombred by nihilistic pessimism, challenged by Shaw, inspired by young Rupert Brooke, T.S. Eliot, Yeats, D.H. Lawrence, jolted by Wyndham Lewis's blast into Cubism and the modern French masters' significant form, Epstein's sculpture, Stravinsky's music, booed and cheered the first Russian ballets and American jazz. Blue eyes, white skin, slender frame. Nancy at age 18, Iris said of her, had a distinctive light swaying way of walking. She spoke in high piping notes, punctuated by odd stresses and pouncing exclamations of jubilance or rejection. She was both delicate and shocking, not exactly witty, but perceptive and always surprising. No dull dinginess obscured the quality of crystal, neatly crisp, gracefully turbulent, arrogantly disruptive, and brave. Nancy and Iris rented a studio apartment to prepare for balls and practice art in. They also brought boys there unchaperoned. By this age, Nancy was making friends and conquests. One friend who knocked on Lady Cunard's door was Ezra Pound, whom Nancy said had lynx-like eyes. Ezra was a part of the Vorticist movement at the time and contributed to Wyndham Lewis's satirical magazine, Blast. Nancy's first published poem appeared in Eton College Chronicle in 1915, when her cousin Victor Cunard was editor. But she saw in Blast that art could be subversive. In 1915, Sidney Fairbairn, an Australian-born Englishman at age 23, joined the Royal Bucks Hussars, a yeomanry regiment. By spring, he was wounded at Gallipoli, evacuated to Cairo, and sent home on leave. He and Nancy announced their engagement in 1916. Nancy's friends and family thought the match was horrible. Fairbairn was far too conventional. Ironically, Lady Cunard called in Sir Bash to dissuade Nancy from the marriage. A newspaper reported of the couple, "Nancy was an exquisite specimen of English girlhood, fresh, sweet to look at, sweet in disposition, and full of fun. She also possesses a strong capacity for deep feeling. Her hobby in life will probably be dogs." 20 months later, the marriage was over. On top of Fairbairn being a Philistine, Nancy found marriage claustrophobic. In escaping her much-loved society mother, she had run headfirst into another smothering situation. A friend of Nancy's at this time was Sybil Hart Davis, unconventional like Nancy. They both set up house near Kingston Bagpews in Oxfordshire with Sybil's 2 children, Nancy's maid, and a cook. While their husbands were away in the trenches, when they weren't throwing parties, Nancy was chain-smoking and writing poetry. During this time, Nancy's literary connections had led to some of her individual poems being published. The problem was, they sounded try-hard, but it didn't discourage her any. In 1917, Nancy fell in love with one of Fairbairn's brother officers, Peter Broughton Adderley. It was 5 days of bliss before he was called back to the war. He returned to Nancy again in the summer of 1918, reading each other poetry and novels in long grass under the trees. By October, like many of Nancy and Sybil's friends, Adderley was killed in battle. Nancy was devastated and had seen him as her chance at happiness. By war's end, her husband had returned home and Nancy decided on divorce. She would later villainize Fairbairn as a monster, when more likely the dissolution was a case of 2 people not right for each other, with 0 abuse involved. They separated immediately and divorced officially in 1925. If that wasn't bad enough, in 1919, Nancy had caught the Spanish flu. She stayed with her mother in Grosvenor Square and convalesced in the south of France with a chaperone. She felt as though her life lacked sense and purpose. She was high-spirited and spoiled. Her interest was on her own poetry, but she hadn't seriously considered anyone else's. To occupy her thoughts, she busied herself travelling, flirting, and partying, spending some of her time in a London cafe club called The Tower. It was a literary and artistic hangout ran by Austrian proprietor Rudolf Stulich and properly called the Eiffel Tower. It was a haunt of Wyndham Lewis's and would become Nancy's for the next 10 years. Throughout her marriage, she remained in correspondence with George Moore, read his romance books with boys, and commented to her friends on the father question. Shall we ever know? It seemed to me that if it were true, and GM is my real father, I should become quite a different personality, and a much more contented one. Nancy, in the 20s, her popularity at the time is owed to having a personality that matched the era. She is a transformation of the Edwardian new woman into the independent, unconventional, free-living flapper. She cut her hair, wore short skirts, smoked and drank, and had casual affairs. Critic Raymond Mortimer found her bewitching. Poet William Carlos Williams found her disquieting, empty, appealing, and unassailable. The irony is, Nancy hated the cult following of the Roaring Twenties and her role she played in it. But she didn't have a choice. She had moved to Paris and become a muse. Enter Michael Arlen. Armenian-born, English-raised, Arlen met Nancy in spring of 1920 in a London taxi. She dropped her diamond brooch without realizing it, and Arlen returned it like a cavalier. He was determined to become a writer and achieve fame and fortune. He was 23, Nancy 24. He fell in love. They became regulars at the Tower and met in London and Paris over the next few years. Nancy nicknamed him the Baron. His first novel, Piracy, was published in 1922 and contains two characters, Virginia and her mother, Lady Carnal, that have obvious overtones of Nancy and Lady Cunard. But it was the 1924 publication of The Green Hat, which became a bestseller and cast Arlen into prominence. The heroine, Iris March, later Iris Storm, is physically accurate to Nancy, though only marginally resembles Nancy's personality. The book features an illness Nancy went through as a result of a hysterectomy in late 1920, early 1921 in a Paris clinic. With the character Iris March, there's more of a conventional morality to her. Arlen mixed pre-war mores with post-war taboos, and that's partly why the book was so successful. The Green Hat also features a yellow Hispano Suiza, which may have inspired the yellow Rolls-Royce that appears in The Great Gatsby, a book that came out the following year. Fitzgerald raved about Arlen's novels to Hemingway, which Hemingway later depicted in A Movable Feast on their car ride to Paris. Enter Aldous Huxley. Unlike the affair Nancy had with Arlen, the infatuation was all Huxley's. In 1922, Huxley was 28 years old, living in a Paddington flat, married to Maria Niece with a bouncing baby boy. Nancy kept Huxley dangling. He'd wait for her telephone calls or hang around her at parties and nightclubs. One time, he spent a whole night pacing the street below her window. Nancy liked him enough to have a one-night stand and promptly returned him to the back burner. She compared the experience to being crawled over by slugs. In the summer of 1923, Huxley's wife issued an ultimatum. She would leave London the next day with Aldous Huxley or without Aldous Huxley. Aldous Huxley left with Maria Huxley and wrote a novel to get Nancy Cunard out of his system. The result was Antic Hay, where the character, Myra Vivish, is based on Nancy. Nancy appears again in his next novel, Those Barren Leaves, as Barbara. Even Michael Arlen makes an appearance, as the Syrian whom the literary equivalent of Huxley is jealous of. Nancy reprises her role yet a third time in Point Counterpoint, as Lucy Tantamount. And yes, there is a fourth reprisal. Nancy recognized herself in Eyeless in Gaza as one of the sunbathing lovers on the rooftop where a dead dog falls on them from an aeroplane. After that, it appears Huxley finally got Nancy out of his system. In 1922, in Paris, Nancy had an affair with Ezra Pound. They went on a walking tour together. He later put her in one of his cantos, poem number 80, and despite their polarizing political views, They ended up being good friends. In Venice, Nancy had an affair with Wyndham Lewis. He put her in his novel, The Roaring Queen, as the character Baby Bucktrout. From 1921 to 1925, when Nancy wasn't being a muse, she actually wrote poetry. Her first volume, Outlaws, came out in 1921, published by a small London press paid for by Nancy. The poems are considered stilted, old-fashioned, and archaic, even for 1921, but reviews were good. Lady Emerald Cunard would encourage publishers over lunch or dinner to publish Nancy's poems in The Nation or in The Observer. When Nancy sent a poem to Ezra Pound to be published in The Dial, he gave her work the harsh criticism it needed. Pound writes,
"I will take the poems to The Dial this evening. But my dear, why? Why the devil do you write in that obsolete dialect and with the cadences of the late Alfred Tennyson? You haven't asked for criticism, only I don't know who else is to give it to you. Nobody in England knows anything except Eliot, and he's too weary and too polite to distribute it."
Eliot being polite was hyperbole. It was during the winter of 21 that Pound helped Eliot with The Wasteland and told him to cut a section that ridiculed a society girl who writes poetry. The society girl named Fresca is believed to have been Nancy Cunard. In the summer of 21, the peripatetic Nancy was in Saint-Martin-Église. George Moore came to visit and suggested she write a narrative poem. The culmination of Nancy's efforts came in April 1925, when the Hogarth Press, run by Leonard and Virginia Woolf, published her long poem, Parallax. Detractors thought it was derivative of The Wasteland. The champions thought that it had a complexity and grasp of reality which was so frequently lacking from women's poetry. For Nancy, Paris in the 20s was a whirlwind of popular cafes like La Rotonde, the Café Cyrano, the Jockey Club, Boule Noire, Bal Negre, and the Plantation, and notable faces like inventor of Dadaism Tristan Tzara, sculptor Constantine Brunkush, Oscar Wilde's niece Dolly Wilde, journalist Janet Flanner, novelist Salita Solano, painter and pianist Eugene McCown, who did the cover for Parallax, painter Nina Hamnet, the doctor poet William Carlos Williams, poet Robert McCalman, photographer Man Ray, French poet Léon Paul Fargue, and painters André Derain, Moïse Kissling, and Marie Laurencin, French novelist Jean Cocteau, Raymond Radiguet, René Crevel, Pierre Drieux La Rochelle, and Philippe Soupeau, and surrealists Louis Aragon and André Breton, among others. Nancy also partied with friends Iris Tree and George Moore, who was tagging along from the Belle Epoque. Things were getting weird. One night, after a leisurely dinner at Foyot's, Moore asked Nancy up in his room.
"I do wish you'd let me see you naked. I'm an old man. Or at least let me see your naked back."
In Nancy's words, something inside me said, "Do this." And without more ado, facing away from him, I took off all my clothes, standing motionless a few feet from where he sat. How lightly, how easily it came about. My clothes left me, lying in a graceful summer pool on the floor, as if they had slipped away of themselves. The night was warm and the mood serene. Without hesitation, my long, naked back and legs were at last in front of him, and the silence was complete. Moore responded,
"Oh, what a beautiful back you have, Nancy. It is as long as a weasel's."
When Moore's next novel, Ulick and Sarasha, was released in 1926, Nancy's back had been given to the Irish peasant woman Bridget, married to the old dying man named Tig. Nancy's base of operations in Paris was her ground floor flat on Rue Le Regatier, though she sometimes visited another paternal figure in Italy, novelist Norman Douglas, who would tell her when she had had enough to drink and did not express the wish to see her naked back. He was, however, a paedophile. Nancy was in denial of this fact and would adamantly defend him later when he was attacked in the British press. In 1925, Nancy's real father died. She had managed to make it to his bedside in time. He left her about £14,000, a silver vase presented to her great-grandfather Samuel Cunard by the people of Boston, and a life-size silver figure of a fox presented to Sir Bash by his hunting party in 1888. He left nothing for his ex-wife. Around Nancy's 30th birthday in 1926, she adopted her signature fashion of wearing African ivory bracelets. As a 6-year-old girl, she had dreams about Africa and the Sahara Desert. This affinity for Africa was rekindled by the Surrealists' use of masks and decor. African art was considered primitive. For a wealthy society girl to wear African bracelets turned heads and shocked hearts. The bracelets represent her love of Africa, escape, and rebellion. Author William Plomer said they sounded like the crack of billiard balls or a skeleton on a cakewalk. On rare occasions, they've even been known to cause boyfriends some light bruising. In 1922, André Breton, Louis Aragon, and Paul Eluard left the Dadaist movement to form the Surrealists, a term coined by French poet Guillaume Apollinaire. They were convinced the origins of creative impulse lay in the subconscious, and they intended to upheave society's way of thinking. If rationality led to war, irrationality may prolong peace. Louis Aragon and Nancy became a couple in 1926, of which George Moore approved. And yes, Aragon put Nancy in a novel, Blanche ou l'oubli, translation, White or Oblivion. When they danced, Aragon made Nancy's bracelets click and clack to the music. Nancy and the Surrealists had their similarities and their differences. Some feared Nancy's aristocratic roots, while others praised her ability to rebel. Like Nancy, many of the Surrealists rebelled against their parents to get the freedom they so desired. However, Nancy was wealthy and often showered Aragon with money, which irked Breton to no end. Despite all the Surrealists' unconventionality, they didn't allow women in the group. Though it didn't matter much in Nancy's case. She wanted an open relationship, and Aragon didn't. Her involvement with the Surrealists wouldn't have lasted. Before parting ways, Aragon introduced Nancy to far-left politics. The Surrealists ended up disbanding over this very issue. Some became communists, others didn't. In 1927, Nancy sold her Paris flat and moved into a farmhouse 60 miles away in the small village of La Chapelle-Réanville in Normandy. Nancy dubbed it Le Puits Carré, after a square-shaped well that sat on the property. In 1928, William Byrd, owner of the Three Mountains Press, which had published Ford Madox Ford, Hemingway, Williams, and Pound, sold his company and his 19th-century Belgian Mathieu machine for £300 to Nancy. He came to Le Puits Carré's outbuilding and helped install it, even throwing in some old Castellon typeface. Byrd introduced her to a professional printer called Levy to print for her and Aragon. Upon Levy's arrival, he was bewildered to learn that he was to teach them how to use it. Levy was pushy, because a printer's apprentice needed 7 years before printing on their own. Nancy told him, "Thank goodness there's none of that here, Monsieur Levy. We're going to forge ahead. My intention is to learn from you everything I possibly can, as quickly as may be, so as to be able to work without you. Do you see? I like this beginning very much. The Hours Press was born. The first real job was a short story by George Moore called Peronic the Fool. In 95-degree heat, the ink didn't stay on the paper. Levies smiled whenever Nancy messed up. By 1928, Aragon and Nancy were in Venice. Journalist Janet Flanner remembered non-stop arguments. Aragon was always packing and unpacking his suitcases. He threatened to kill himself. Nancy said, "Go ahead," knowing he always returned in the end. But this time, Aragon was found in his hotel room, overdosed on drugs. He was rescued and then left at once. In true Nancy style, she would solve old problems by getting into new ones. One evening in Venice, Nancy and her cousin went to dance at the Hotel Luna, where a group of Black American jazz musicians were performing, Eddie South and his Alabamians. The pianist's name was Henry Crowder, aged 36. Nancy called the band over to her table after the set. What unfolded was the most important relationship of Nancy's life. Through Henry Crowder, Nancy became a woman who chose deliberately to cross the boundaries of convention, class, and race in pursuit of a cause. The process was to be painful, confusing, at times tasteless, and occasionally absurd. Crowder called it one of the strangest relationships to have ever taken place between a black man and a white woman. Crowder had learned to sing at his church and play piano for the YMCA. He first toured with the school quartet, briefly attended Atlanta University, worked as a postman, a dishwasher in D.C., a handyman, a piano player in a brothel, and took a job as a singer and pianist with a dance orchestra in order to give his girlfriend at the time a better life. He married, had a son, bought a house, and was a manager of many orchestras. His sister said he should try to make it in Chicago. So he moved his family there, experienced strain in his marriage, and joined the Alabamians. Crowder moved with the band to New York. One night in Greenwich Village, a white patron asked if they'd like to play Paris for a year, all expenses paid. The band said yes. Crowder sent his wife back to D.C. But upon arriving in Paris, plans for the cabaret had fallen through. The project was bankrupt. The band stayed on. They got to play at Empire Music Hall, which led them to an offer to play at the Hotel Luna in Venice. After their initial meeting, Nancy came by one afternoon and asked Crowder at the piano for the manager of the hotel. A day or two later, the band was eating dinner at the hotel when a waiter came by and said a lady wanted to speak to the pianist on the phone. Crowder had been adamantly determined not to get involved with white women the whole trip. When Crowder accepted Nancy's invitation and returned to the table to say he was leaving, the band teased him ferociously. He went on a gondola ride to Nancy's apartment for dinner. After a series of love letters, Crowder was infatuated beyond all reason. Nancy was enamored. But Nancy, being Nancy, had also taken a liking to a waiter and a young Italian count. She played them off one another. And one night in a restaurant, a brawl erupted between the men. Nancy left with the count. Crowder was disgusted and fell out of love, though was unable to leave her. She wanted to help Crowder, but on her terms. By summer's end, the Alabamians left for Paris, and so did Crowder and Nancy. She put him up in a small hotel. As this was Paris in the 20s, there were few racial barriers. Nancy's friends loved spending time with them, and Nancy's cousins were polite. Not T.S. Eliot polite, but real polite. Crowder became the center of attention in the black community. In each of them, they found new worlds to explore. Crowder was meeting the rich, the fashionable, and the intelligentsia. Nancy, the raffish world of musicians, actors, boxers, and dancers. One night they had an argument over lesbians. Crowder said that
she told me flatly that she liked lesbians, had enjoyed their company before, and hoped to do so again. My answer was that I wanted nothing to do with lesbians or anyone who had anything to do with them.
"In that case," Nancy replied, "we'd better separate right here."
Since that time, I've met, dined, and danced with many lesbians, and I've had reason to radically change my opinion of them.
Crowder had common sense and a quiet, ironic humour, and often acted as the handbrake to Nancy's wilder impulses. At parties, she would tell him to be more African. Be more African. He'd reply,
I ain't African, I'm American.
She often wanted him to travel with her on a trip to Black Africa. But Crowder didn't care for the idea of visiting a British colony as the companion of a well-connected white woman who enjoyed making scenes. One night in Montmartre, there was a shootout between Crowder's banjo player and a member of a rival band. Bystanders were injured. Nancy and her cousin found the bandmate a lawyer. Crowder decided the nightlife was enough. He would join Nancy at her farmhouse and try to get the Hours Press off the ground. Nancy's friends warned her it was dirty work. But she loved handling the type, choosing the paper, designing the pages, getting her hands greasy at the inking table, and printing stories. She calculated the cost and determined each writer would receive a third of the profit, except George Moore and Norman Douglas, who'd get half. Nancy would wholesale at 10% off and resented the cost of advertising. She would often lose her temper and threaten to sell the whole thing. Crowder would calm her down and took over the packing, wrapping, and delivery. He stayed out of Levy's way, but noticed George the chauffeur being overly familiar with Nancy and realized they'd been to bed together. The driver was fired. One time, on a trip to the bookbindery, Nancy and Crowder got in a car accident. While the case was tied up in court, they left for England. Apart from difficulty in finding Crowder a hotel room, things went smoothly, and Lady Emerald Cunard was successfully avoided. Upon return, they nearly wound up in jail over the car accident, but handled the court case and turned out more prints, among them some of Ezra Pound's cantos. It was then Crowder found his financial reliance on Nancy galling. He was an employee and a lover. Nancy wanted a man who could provide for himself, yet deliberately chose lovers who didn't. Crowder didn't like being strung along with allowances. Tired of the situation, he got a job singing and playing piano at the nightclub Le Bateau Ivre and took a room at a hotel. Nancy took a room there too. Meanwhile, the printing press was transported to Paris at 15 Rue Guénégaud, finally relieving Crowder of the pains of publishing. Life at the Hours Press was frenetic. Nancy hired surrealist friend George Sadoul to help out. While she ran around with her head cut off, promoting books, hiring artists, and securing booksellers, friends would drop into the printery so often she had to lock the door. The stress may have led to an abscess in her throat that left her hardly able to speak. It was in this condition at a room at the Hotel Cristal when she received a knock at the door. She answered.
I am James Joyce, and I've come to talk to you about something it seems to me it is your duty to accomplish.
He wanted Nancy to get Lady Emerald Cunard, to get Sir Thomas Beecham, to get the Irish singer Sullivan hired at the London Opera. In exchange, Joyce later added on a second visit, he might provide some writing to the Hours Press. Given Nancy and her mother's relationship, nothing came of it. However, luck came in the shape of another Irish writer when Nancy decided to hold a contest with prize money. With 3 or 4 days left to go before announcing a winner and no good contenders to choose from, Nancy discovered someone had slipped a poem beneath the door of the Hour's press, titled Horoscope, by a 24-year-old Samuel Beckett. Beckett was poor and had been living in Paris for 2 years. He was a teacher at the École Normale Supérieure and was helping Joyce with typing. Beckett was pleased with the prize and spent the £10 on dinner that evening. He befriended Nancy and Crowder and would meet for drinks at the Café d'Harcourt or head into Montmartre. Beckett found the long nights out with Nancy and friends pointless. Once, at a nightclub, he burst out,
"What in God's name am I doing here?"
Nancy hired a manager for the press while she and Crowder vacationed in the countryside, so that he could work on putting music to the poetry of their friends. The result was appropriately titled Henry Music. The villagers of Crace were amazed by Crowder's black skin and Nancy's English accent. They hired a piano shipped in by 2 oxen. It was on this trip that Nancy said she wanted to bring out an anthology of black history, politics, and art. Crowder hardly thought she was the right person for the job, but steered her in the right direction, giving her the names of all the black leaders in America. For what it was worth, Nancy had joined the Negro cause. But first, someone had let slip at Lady Cunard's lunch party that Nancy had taken a black lover. It had been 2 years since Nancy and Crowder started seeing each other. It's likely Lady Cunard was turning a blind eye, but met with this direct knowledge head-on, she flew into a hysterical rage and threatened to have Crowder deported. Thomas Beecham sent a letter to warn Nancy. Nancy went to an attorney in London who said Crowder was fine so long as he didn't break the law. While in London, Nancy screened a Salvador Dali film, further inflaming her mother, which put George Moore, now 79, caught in the middle. Lady Cunard threatened to remove Nancy from the will and cut off her income, but opted instead to reduce her income, citing the stock market crash of '29. Mother and daughter never spoke again. Now, when it came to Nancy's fight for the black cause, her treatment of Henry Crowder was in stark contrast to her generosity towards his colour. Away from home for too long, Crowder wanted to return to the States. Nancy paid for his trip, expecting he would come back to her. When Crowder arrived in D.C., his wife pressed him about this wealthy white woman he was palling around with, and she did not like the answer. Crowder and his wife decided to live as they so pleased. Nancy took a house in Cagnes and took Raymond Michelet as a lover, aged 18, 16 years her junior. On the run from a conventional father, Aragon and Sadoul had sent Michelet to her house, Le Prix Carré, the previous winter. He spent 2 years with Nancy. When Nancy discovered that the taboos instilled in him by his parents had given him a disabling fear of sex, she briskly set about curing him. According to Michelet, Nancy's operations in late 1920 had physically impaired her sexual responses. She feared being found inadequate by her lovers. One reason why she always got new ones. Another was fear of being alone. To keep busy, Michelet would help with publishing. One time, Nancy suggested he write an article about the African ivory bracelets she so adored. Michelet did some research and found they had an erotic significance. When the bracelets were worn regularly and the ivory became warm from contact with the wearer's body, they gave off an odour similar to semen. Nancy asked him to take that part out of the article. For an 18-year-old boy, Michelet was a stickler for details. He refused. Nancy decided not to publish, instead going with a different article that Michelet submitted for the anthology. But pretty much his literary career died that day. In 1931, Crowder returned and met Nancy at a hotel so not to upset Michelet. Nancy wanted Crowder to go to Italy to focus on music, and she would catch up with him later. Crowder did not like this idea. He resolved to leave for America for good. Nancy had a better idea. She would go with him. Crowder, not against her financial support, accepted. They travelled to Harlem. There, Crowder feared Nancy would test racial prejudice. And she did, going to places where Crowder would not be served. Crowder wanted to avoid scenes. Nancy wanted to create them. By the 1930s, the popularity of Harlem nightclubs was fading, and the Harlem Renaissance at its close. Still, they visited the Savoy, met the staff of W.E.B. Du Bois' Crisis, and befriended Langston Hughes. They also managed to spend time with William Carlos Williams up in New Jersey. After much running around Europe again, Crowder to London for music, Nancy to France for Michelet, and a rendezvous between them in Germany, they found themselves in the exact same position. Crowder wanted to return to America. Nancy paid for his voyage, telling him she'd meet him there later. It was at this time Nancy penned an article for The Crisis titled Black Man and White Ladyship. It was meant to reveal racial prejudice, but ended up being a tirade against her mother. Nancy had gone too far. She lost friends over the piece and received equally scathing remarks directed at her. With the Hour's press closed due to mismanagement, Nancy began in earnest on her anthology, titled Negro. She wrote to anyone and everyone, often out of the blue. If you were a significant black writer in the 1930s, your work is in this book. Upon her return trip to America, an article in the New York Daily Mirror stated that London heiress to the luxury shipping liner, Nancy Cunard, arrived in New York in pursuit of her lover, Paul Robeson. Nancy called a press conference, denied the rumour, and plugged her upcoming anthology. She also asked for funding for the defence attorney for the Scottsboro Boys. The case involved 9 black men charged with raping 2 white women. The backlash against Nancy was immediate and severe, receiving hate mail from all over America. Amused, she took the letters and later published them in the anthology. Crowder remained in D.C., unconcerned, knowing how Nancy loved a fight. She went into hiding as the media hounded her and resurfaced in Boston to collect more contributions for the anthology. Boston journalist Eugene Gordon recalled seeing Nancy in the newsreels at the end of a film that referred to her as the character in Arlen's The Green Hat and Huxley's Point Counterpoint. Gordon already owned and read The Green Hat, but he checked Point Counterpoint out of the library on his way home. When he got there, he received a phone call. It was Nancy Cunard. She would be right over for a piece of his writing. Gordon couldn't believe it. More unbelievable was that when she came up the stairs to his apartment, she was wearing a green hat. Afterwards, Nancy travelled to Cuba and Jamaica and met Marcus Garvey. Some of the contributions needed translating from French. Samuel Beckett, back in Ireland, was hired on. Payment for translators was one thing. When it came to payment for poetry, Nancy considered the project a labour of love. At hearing this news, Sterling Brown wrote her back in ironic vernacular.
Ms. Cunard, I appreciate your good intentions, but you's a rich white lady, and I's just a poor black boy, trying to get along best I can. So I sure would appreciate if you'd pay me just a little something for that little old poem of mine.
Nancy paid. Before she knew it, she was back in London with a reluctant Crowder when the anthology was released. This time, Nancy had taken Edgell Rickword as a lover, and Crowder had taken a young Englishwoman. Rickword worked at Wishart & Co. and found Nancy's book a home there. Negro was published in 1934. It's 855 pages long, everything and the kitchen sink. It's got history, poetry, jazz articles, sheet music, illustrations, and 250 contributions by 150 authors, 2/3 of them black. The poetry section, however, is only 12 pages long. The book has Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, but curiously includes an article by William Carlos Williams of how he found the black maids in his household very attractive while growing up as a boy. Then there was also the matter of Beckett's translations. He rendered the dry voices of the French-speaking authors ornate and romantic. Also, on the whole, many articles written by Nancy give the anthology a communist slant. She believed that communism was the answer to removing class distinctions. Many black artists at the time did, like her writer friend, Claude McKay. In spite of all this, the book is a tour de force and a preserver of culture. At the time, though, reviews were scant. Nancy had alienated liberals with the book's communist views and alienated communists by leaving in their detractors. Some of Nancy's friends, new and old, praised the book, including Langston Hughes, William Pickens, Alan Locke, Arthur Schoenberg, Taylor Gordon, Theodore Dreiser, William Carlos Williams, and the leading communist intellectual, Mike Gold. Communism at the time was a reaction to the Depression, social inequality, and a counterpoint to fascist Italy. Although never joining the party, Nancy wanted to visit Moscow. Crowder declined. Their relationship was the same old song. She would berate him for not finding work, then objected when he did because his plans interfered with hers. There was no winning. Their relationship disintegrated in 1935, and they never saw each other again. The Moscow trip proved uneventful. As if to make up for it, she became a journalist in the Spanish Civil War, writing articles for the Associated Negro Press, New Times, and the Spanish newsletter. The Spanish Civil War had Italy and Germany on the side of Franco, Russia for the Spanish Republic, and Britain and France maintaining an uneasy facade of non-intervention. Nancy was on the ground in Spain, supporting the Republic. She got as close to the fighting as she could at the fronts of Illescas and Navalcarnero. When not at the front, she spent time in Madrid. It was there, in the Hotel Florida, she met up with Ernest Hemingway. Nancy recalled him taking her boots off so she could warm her feet. He was laying on a bed just back from the trenches. Hemingway told Nancy and her travelling companion, John Banting, they were too late. He had sent off his play, The Fifth Column, for publication, and he couldn't make them characters in it. Banting said he was glad to miss the honour. Then, as Nancy and Banting proceeded to smoke cigarettes, Hemingway said,
"It might be marijuana."
When Nancy ended her trip, she returned to her home in Réanville, blew the dust off the old Hours press machine, and published Poets of the World Defend the Spanish People. Tristan Tzara, Louis Aragon, and Langston Hughes contributed, as did her new friends, including 32-year-old Chilean poet Pablo Neruda. Neruda described Nancy, at age 40, as quixotic, unalterable, fearless, and pathetic. Despite this so-named pathetic attribute, Nancy met a new poet in France whose contribution turned out to be the most influential poem of the series, titled Spain by W.H. Auden. Auden had visited Spain in 1937 at the age of 29 and later renounced the poem. Nancy also organised a questionnaire to be filled out by the writers and poets of England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales on whether they were for Franco or the Republic. 148 responses were published by the Left Review. They were either for, against, or neutral. George Orwell refused to participate and wrote back,
"Will you please stop sending me this bloody rubbish? This is the second or third time I have had it. I am not one of your fashionable pansies like Auden and Spender. I was 6 months in Spain, most of the time fighting." I have a bullet hole in me at present, and I am not going to write blah defending democracy or gallant little anybody.
In 1938, Nancy wanted to vacation in Tunisia, and she wanted to bring her last living father figure, Norman Douglas, along for the ride. George Moore had died in 1933. On Nancy's way to meet Norman Douglas in Venice, she ran into her old friend, Michael Arlen, now happily married. Arlen served as witness for Nancy's passport renewal, and she was off. Nancy and Douglas had a rough and crowded crossing to Tunisia, laughing when Nancy tumbled across the saloon and stood up with her drink still full. She slept on a pile of luggage in the companionway. After this respite, Nancy headed back to Spain and was stopped at the border at Perpignan. Barcelona had fallen, and France was deciding whether or not to let civilians and the wounded cross. They did, all 15,000. Nancy followed the refugees, unsure if they would be better off back in Spain. When she returned home to Réanville, she received a letter from a waiter friend she had met in Madrid. His name was Ángel Goded, and he was trapped in one of Franco's camps in Argelès. He wrote,
"The biggest favor I've ever asked you in my life. I'm counting on you to get me out of here, and I know you will."
When Nancy tried to bureaucratically secure his release through a Paris organization that helped release Spanish intellectuals, they assigned her 4 other men, not Ángel Goded. Nancy, unable to leave the other 4 in the camps, took all 5 back to her house for 3 months. Ángel helped out around the property. The 4 intellectuals didn't do much. Disappointed in Franco's victory, Nancy left France for Santiago, Chile. Pablo Neruda, Delia del Carril, and Luis Enrique Delano gave her a warm reception. Neruda recalls that she took a poet as her lover, a slovenly vagrant, a Chilean of Basque descent, with some talent but no teeth. What's more, Nancy's new lover was a hopeless drunk and gave her nightly beatings that forced her to appear in public, wearing enormous dark glasses. Nancy remembered swimming at the beach, eating huge crabs, strange seaweed the poor would eat, and the band of wild children who lived in the scrubland on the outskirts of the city. In June 1940, France fell. Nancy, fearful of her surrealist friends, though not in a hurry to return to Great Britain, travelled to Mexico to hang out with writers and intellectuals. Then she went on to Trinidad, where her cousin was private secretary to the governor, and to her surprise, her anthology Negro was famous. Then she was off to Havana to touch base with poet Nicholas Guillen, then on to New York in a meet-up with novelist Kay Boyle. By 1941, Nancy was back in London. She knew where her loyalties lied. She joined the war effort, translating French radio broadcasts. She later got a job as secretary to a French officer. Meanwhile, Thomas Beecham had left Lady Cunard, and Lady Cunard left her bomb-damaged home in Grosvenor Square for a 3-room suite at the Dorchester. There was an incident one evening shortly after the war where Lady Cunard and her friends were motoring home from the theatre. A woman was in the road. Their car swerved to avoid her. Lady Cunard gasped. It was Nancy. The car rode on in silence. Another strange interlude took place, this time during the war. Nancy moved into a flat on Jermyn Street that she found through, of all people, Alistair Crowley, who used to live there. Nancy was amused by his reputation for black magic and wickedness. She visited him near Oxford, where he gave her a magic cocktail with a mysterious blue colour and told her he was working against Hitler on the astral plane. During the 40s, Nancy put together a pamphlet called The White Man's Duty. It's a dialogue with journalist George Padmore about a colony's right to self-govern and about transforming society into a social commonwealth. Nancy also produced another anthology called Poems for France, published in 1944. In 1945, France was liberated. Nancy put on an ushanka, picked up her typewriter, and returned to Rionville. She had received advance warning that her farmhouse had been ransacked by Germans and locals. She braced herself, but when she arrived, she was devastated nonetheless. Paintings, oriental rugs, and the beaded curtains that once hung in the Hour's press were stolen, along with letters from T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and the rest of her famous Paris friends. She put Le Puy Carré up for sale and stayed in Paris hotels and borrowed flats with her boyfriend at the time, Maurice Gilbert. With Ezra Pound fresh on her mind, she penned him a letter. He had been convicted of treason and was now locked up in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in D.C. on a plea of insanity. She reminisced about their times in Paris, about Henry Crowder, and critiquing her poetry. She called him a scoundrel for his siding with fascism and for his Italian radio broadcasts, some of which she translated. She also called him the enemy of integrity and sent off the letter.
Nancy Cunard calling, Ezra Pound speaking. What the blue beggaring hell are you talking about?
Nancy received another communication later while staying in Giverny. Lady Cunard had taken ill. She was on her deathbed with throat cancer. William Finley, Nancy's current lover, remembered that Lady Cunard had not asked for Nancy to come, and Nancy stubbornly refused to go. Lady Cunard passed in 1948, and her will was split 3 ways: to Nancy, to Lady Diana Cooper, and to a Sir Robert Abdy. Nancy did not attend the service or funeral. She did, however, travel up to London to settle her mother's estate, with an eye on a portrait of George Moore and of George Moore's Manet, Études pour le linge. Most everything else was sold. Nancy received less than expected, £300 a month. Nancy, in her early 50s, bought an old house on a hillside by a hamlet called La Motte-Fénelon, 12 miles from Souillac in the Dordogne. She spent the 1950s travelling, writing, and with friends. Lovers came and went. English novelist Anthony Thorne and his wife became Nancy's source of hospitality and support. She was able to see Norman Douglas in Venice once more before he passed in 1952 of a prescription overdose. She loved and respected him, and appreciated the affectionate mock strictness with which he would deplore her vagaries. Nancy had her next book, which materialized as Grand Man, Memories of Norman Douglas. You can bet how well that sold. In London, she met a young American named Charles Burkhart, doing a thesis on George Moore. Nancy took him under her wing. They drank in the Café Royal, found Moore's old house on Ebury Street, went antique hunting, and attended a 1920s musical in the West End. On the occasion, they were seated behind Princess Margaret. Nancy showed up late and dishevelled, looked at the play and said, "Oh no, darling, the 20s weren't like that." At the cast party, she was referred to as Lady Cunard. When Burkhart returned to America, Nancy renewed correspondence with Henry Crowder. He was working in the U.S. Bureau of Customs, handling mail. Life was dull, but he didn't mind. He had spent 22.5 months in a POW camp in the 40s. In 1955, Burkhart wrote Nancy that Crowder had died. What followed was a letter from Crowder's wife Frankie, declaring how she was Henry's only true love. Nancy was crushed, but then later laughed about it. She had a new book project to busy her mind, G.M., Memories of George Moore. Due to the criticism her biography on Douglas had received, her book about Moore would be wholly personal, about the man, not his works. She typed it as his portrait stared at her from the wall.
Nancy, let me see your naked back. What is the harm? What is the harm?
Anthony Thorne, who read the draft, advised her to leave out the weaselback incident. Nancy complied. Reviews were glowing. She was meeting her old friends again, like Samuel Beckett. Beckett, writing on the recent success of Waiting for Godot, described Nancy at this stage as looking very wraithy. Nancy also met Iris Tree, who described her like this. The nymph I remember was still there, but concealed, as it were like a mermaid in its scales. I gathered that her days were lonely, somehow malevolent, bereft of surrounding sympathy or love. In Spain, Nancy was arrested on a train for disturbance and drew attention to herself in a bar with loud political arguments. When she reached London, she was in a bad way. Septic foot, bronchitis, nervous collapse. The Thornes bought a house in Maida Vale and had a separate flat that Nancy wanted. She was undernourished, wouldn't eat, detested being made a fuss of, and felt dreadful.
About it right now. Everything's okay.
By the 1960s, the same thing happened again. Nancy went to Spain, got arrested, and returned to London. This time, she was worse off. Her mind was cracking. Her tendency to paranoia swelled to insanity. Anyone who tried to calm or restrain her was a fascist spy. She roamed London drinking constantly, insulting policemen, and making sexual propositions to strangers. One evening, Mrs. Thorne met Nancy outside her house and paid the taxi, but no tip.
No tip, anyway. He tried to have an affair with me. He even put my head under the wheel.
Nancy walked into the house with a bag of ham sandwiches and started throwing the crust into the empty fireplace. Mrs. Thorne, with her husband away, feared the house would burn down over her head as she slept. On one occasion, in another flat, Nancy set her clothes on fire, declaring,
I shan't need these anymore.
In May, she was arrested in the King's Road on charges of soliciting prostitution, followed by drunken disorderly behaviour. She fought the police and threw her shoes at the magistrate who sent her to Holloway Prison on remand for a medical report. The findings: mental disorder aggravated by alcohol. When Anthony Thorne visited her in St. Clement's, she asked him for some matches. For some reason, he gave them to her, which she tucked into the hem of her skirt. There was a photograph of him in the room. She placed it facing out.
There is no point having a photograph unless everybody can enjoy it.
She was certified insane. As time went on, friends like Aragon, Sadoul, and Flanner rallied to her defence. Some believed she was insane. Others believed the ruling was rash. In a letter to poet William Plomer, Nancy wrote,
At least doctors and nurses and staff laugh at the certified insane business. They know better. For there really are some honest-to-God goofies here. Poor bitches. One groans night long and nips off the heads of pretty flowers. Another one thinks she's a countess and is humoured. She goes about with bits of newspaper pretending to read them. Another one, the fat girl, screams like a sedgebird. You never heard a whale of a cry. Another one... I will not weary you further. Nothing interesting, as you can see.
Nancy was released, prescribed antidepressants, and advised to abstain from alcohol. After recovering in her friend Louise Theis's care, she collected her Spanish blacksmith lover named Thomas, who Aragon had been keeping afloat, and together they went back to Le Motte Fenelon. Nancy and Thomas's relationship ended quickly. By 1964, she was staying at the Villa Pomone with someone new, Jean Guérin. She was short of breath, unsteady on her feet, and writing poetry. By the end of January 1965, Nancy fell and broke her thigh. She lay in agony for 10 hours until she could reach a doctor. An ambulance whisked her off to a clinic in Nice for an operation. She was told not to walk for 3 months. During recovery, she provoked a violent quarrel with Guérin. He asked her to leave. The next day, she packed an old suitcase and boarded a train. When the conductor asked for her ticket, she ate it. On March 9th, she arrived unannounced at a small house shared by Solita Solano and Elizabeth Clark in Orgeval, outside Paris. The taxi driver carried her in and deposited her in an armchair.
Pay him for me, ducky,
said Nancy. She wrote poems, drank wine, and threw lit cigarettes on the carpet. When she wanted a bath, Solita carried her to the tub. The next day, Nancy decided she would live with them. Solita told her they were actually just leaving that day and instructed a taxi driver to take her to Janet Flanner's house in Paris. Somehow, Nancy wound up at Raymond Michelet and his girlfriend's apartment. Michelet was in shock. Nancy assumed he would take care of her, and together they'd work on another book. She spent the day on his sofa, semi-delirious. Georges Sadoul came over, and he and Michelet brainstormed what on earth to do with her. Nancy had the answer. She had reserved a small hotel room in the Latin Quarter. The staff knew her well. Sadoul and Michelet weren't sure, but when they called the hotel, it turned out they did have a room for her. They brought her to the lobby. When they found out the hotel had no lift, they carried her to the stairs, which Nancy insisted on mounting herself. She climbed the staircase 1 step at a time, sitting on each step before attempting the next one, while wearing a turban, a leopard skin coat, and ivory bracelets. She greeted guests as they walked past.
This woman has just today had her 69th birthday and entered her 70th year.
It really was her birthday, and into the next day. The stair climb took 2 hours, the longest of Sadoul's life, he later said. Sadoul and Michelet sent a psychiatrist up to see her. The doctor said her body needed to recover before her mind could be treated, and left. Nancy phoned Michelet and accused him of sending a police spy to see her and of being a fascist himself. Michelet hurried to the hotel and found burnt papers on the floor of her room. The hotel staff had discovered smoke under the door and put the fire out. Nancy was gone. She had gotten downstairs and hailed a cab. Police found her on the street with a banged-up head and took her to l'Hôpital Cochin. 3 days later, on March 16, 1965, under an oxygen tent in a public ward, Nancy Cunard died. Her ashes were interred in Père Lachaise Cemetery, Division 87, in a columbarium, urn number 9016. The marker was removed in 1973. Janet Flanner, Raymond Michelet, Solita Solano, and art critic Douglas Cooper attended the funeral. For several days after, friends and family in America, France, and England received Nancy's incoherent letters and postcards.